Hello, everyone. Oh, there's a nice echo in here. I like that. Now I have to hear myself. This isn't great. Well, I'm Kevin Peters. This session is Lync automation and scripting. Little quick background blurb on me. I'm a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master and a Microsoft Certified Master in Lync. Also a managing architect from Unify Square. Tweet under Lync Guy, and my website is ocsguy.com. So my website needs an upgrade now. Right? So quick set of topics here. We're going to go over some PowerShell and Lync management shell tips. Then we're going to get into storing information, using applications within our scripts, bulk changes, output and error checking, and then using GUIs. So the session starts off a little easy and then eases into a little more advanced stuff as we go. So please bear with me as we go through. Some of the intro stuff might be a little bit lower side. And by the way, feel free if you have a question, raise your hand, head to a microphone. I'll try and answer it. If I can't, we can always take it offline later, but I don't mind being interrupted. So if you have a burning question, just have at it. All right, so we're going to start out with a couple of quick PowerShell and Lync management shell tips. The first one is getting help. The most important thing, I use help constantly in PowerShell. So the command has, what's that? Okay. So the first command you'll need to know, obviously, is get help, and then the command you're looking for help on. And when you run that command, it brings up all the different syntax and aliases and everything else you can see there. It's kind of like a mini TechEd right there in your PowerShell screen, right? Other than just the get help command, the get help's great when you know the commandlet you're working on. But if you can't remember the commandlet because there's how many of those things now? You can also do help and then in single quotes and a star put in what you're looking for. And what you'll get back, in this example, as you see I put help and then star AD, and I got back everything that had AD in it. So you don't want to do help star A or something. You'd be there for a while reading, but this it's a pretty good piece of information either way. When you run the get help, you can also do a dash full. So if we go back here, get help new AD group dash full, we'll show you everything. You can do a dash detailed and a dash examples. Dash examples being my favorite because it's nice to actually see what it is you're trying to do, somebody else having already done it. All right, so this one coming from a very, very long time ago doing command line in Cisco. This is one of my favorite features. It's tab complete. So you just start typing new dash CS or new dash whatever it is and hit tab, and you get your first command that's available. Keep hitting tab, and you'll see the other commands that are available. So new dash A and start hitting tab, new dash CS, start hitting tab, and you can just run through all the commands. It's really helpful when you have to type something like invoke dash CS management store replication, which is really a mouthful and really a lot to type. And if your typing skills are anything like mine, there's no shot you're going to get it right the first time, right? And the tab completion also works with parameters. So if you're doing dash identity, you can type dash ID tab. And actually identity, I think you can even just leave dash ID. If you have enough characters for it to be unique, in some instances, that will work as well. And then our last tab complete there. So quick show of hands, how many people do scripting already? Oh, wow. You guys are probably all better than me. Does anybody else want to come up? Next show of hands, how many people use ISE to write their scripts? Does everybody else Notepad? Power GUI? Okay. All right, so I'm a big user of ISE. So ISE has the IntelliSense menus added in the Windows 8 Server 2012 version, and I think you can install the newer version of ISE on even Windows 7, and it'll work there as well. I've not tried it, but I've heard that. So just like we have tab complete in the PowerShell itself, you have a syntax menu available. So if you type new dash, you'll see all the commands pop up. Once you find your command, you'll see a bunch of different variables there in a little pop-up window as well. So it's a very, very helpful thing to have for when you're writing code and you have hundreds of variables or commandlets to remember. So the big things for me are, I know most of the Lync commands at this point, but when I'm doing something with Active Directory or Exchange, I'm not quite there yet, or even the base OS ones, so this is really helpful for me in those types of scenarios. So an ISE is a really great place to write your code. I'm sure the Power GUI is probably very, very good as well. I've just never really played with it. All right, so the next thing we'll talk about, as I just mentioned, sometimes you're doing more than just Lync commands, so you're going to want to import other modules. So this command, as an example, import module Lync, if you're running just a regular PowerShell server 2008 R2, you'll need to run this to get your Lync commands up. So if you're writing scripts or PS1 files, you want to run them with PowerShell, you need to put this at the top of your script so that the Lync commands are able to be run from within your script, right? And then once we've done that, we see new -cs, which is anything Lync related, and we see we can start tab completing through everything. So it's really helpful if you're writing a script that's going to do AD, Exchange, Lync, and all kinds of other things in one script, just to import all your modules. If you're running the script from PowerShell on 2012, it defaults to having the Lync module in there, so you don't have to do this if you're only writing the script for 2012. All right, how many people have used the pipe before in their scripting? Geez, this is a lot better of a crowd than I had last time. A lot of people weren't even sure what pipe was, so this is really good. So a pipe is basically just an assembly line. We're pulling materials in and doing things with them. So we have one example here where we're just doing a get-cs user where object is $enabled equals true. So all we're doing here is saying we want to find all the users who are enabled for Lync, right? Then we can also pipe that out to an export CSV file. Nothing too crazy here. And you'll notice on some of the slides, for the folks who aren't as familiar with these topics, I try to, wherever possible, put in a reference URL at the bottom of the slide. And also, if there's a PowerShell command that can help, so if you look at the bottom, get help about_pipeline, if you run that from PowerShell, it'll bring up a pipeline help. So pipeline's a really nice way to pull data from one commandlet into another, and it's nice. As an example, I have a client who has their Lync CMS over in the UK, but they're a global organization. They have pools in America, and when we need to bulk move users, like in the event of a disaster or something like that, which we've had to test in the past, we do a filtered get-cs user and pipe it to a move-cs user. And that actually improved the performance, because when I tried to just run a get-cs user against a CMS way over in the UK over a VPN, it was taking 10 to 15 seconds per user. And when you run the filtered command, it's going to run directly against the CMS, and it moved everybody in a few seconds instead. All right, so remote connections is the next thing. If you're running a script, a lot of folks are automating their provisioning process from start to finish now. There's a number of different ways to do that. One of those, the one I've used in my lab in the past, is to do remote connections. So you can do a remote connection to Exchange, a remote connection to Lync, whatever other PowerShells that are available, remote connections will be available. So to run remote connections, we need to have credentials first of all. So we're going to have to do a get credentials. Then we're going to have to configure our session variables and import the session. So I've got a quick example on how to do this. So first we have a variable user credential equals get-credential. So get-credential is a nice little pop-up box that pops up and asks you for your credentials. And then it stores them in that variable user credential. And we'll talk about variables again in a second here. So once we have our credentials, we need to configure our session. So you would say our Lync session is a new PS session with a connection URI to our Lync front-end servers. And the credential is the credential we just captured before. So you can see an example of that. And then last but not least is import the session, right? Import -ps session, and we in the previous screen here, we had named our session, or our variable Lync session, right? So now we're importing the Lync session. And you can see you'll get the little little zeros bouncing across the screen, and eventually it'll complete, and you'll see the module's completely imported, and you can see a few of the commands pop up there. All right, so now we're going to shift on to creating some scripts and talk less about PowerShell for a few minutes. The first thing is use an editor like ISE. You'll find that there's a ton of different PowerShell editors out there. There's some really good ones. I use ISE as a default just because that's what I used to write in Notepad, and somebody convinced me I should do it in ISE. And I was like, wow, this is great. It's color-coded. I can do neat things, and I can collapse brackets. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. So it's above and beyond where I even started. So anything better than that, I haven't even tried yet. So find an editor like that. ISE is a really good one to start with if you haven't used an editor before. Then the next thing is always test your commands directly in PowerShell. So it's great to run a script and do something 1,000 times, but it's great if the thing you did 1,000 times was actually what you wanted to do, right? So I see a lot of people send out scripts, and they're like, oh, it doesn't work right. And I'm like, the commandlet's mistyped completely. You have new-sc or something like that. So the new ISE helps a lot more with that. But it's really important if you're going to create a script, you need to know what it's going to do. So if I'm doing something in a script 10,000 times, I'm going to take the time to do it once in PowerShell in my lab and then copy it out. And I'm a big fan of copy and paste because I have horrible typing skills. So the next one after that is, of course, comment your code. It's great if you're the only person who's ever going to use that code and you remember everything about it for the rest of your life. At this point, I've written a couple hundred scripts. I don't even remember some of them. People say, oh, when you did this script, And I'm like, what script? Can you send me it? I don't even have it anymore. So commenting your code's a big thing. There are some developers who insist that every line of code should have a comment on it. I'm not quite that hardcore, but you'll definitely want a comment at the top. And a comment in a PowerShell script is just, a pound or a hash symbol and then what you want to say about it. And that's all you really need to do. Then, of course, test it in your lab. You do something 10,000 times, you might want to do it right. And then always use a transcript option. So I'm a big fan of transcript. I always add the dash verbose to the end of all my commands, and I always do a transcript. Even if I'm doing an output as well, I like to see what went on in the console. And then sign your scripts with a certificate if you're going to share them. So this is a big one. On my site, I have a few scripts out there. Most of them are signed at this point. Not all of them, but I do have a code signing cert that you can get from, I know DigiCert has them. I'm sure there are other vendors that have them too. So anytime I'm going to put a script out there, I sign it. And even when I'm giving scripts to clients or to our other engineers, I sign them. Because if I hand them a script and it's signed, and then they make a change to it, it's not going to work anymore, and they're going to have to remove the code block for the signature, right? And then I'll know, hey, there's no code block here for the signature. Did you edit this? Yes, I did. Well, what did you do? So that's a telltale sign for me, and it tends to be you write a script, someone's going to go out and make changes to it. So at least this tells you, this tells you somebody made a change, right? And if you have a newer certificate, it actually helps with the verification, and people don't get prompted to run an unsigned script. And then last is just save everything as a PS1 and you can run it, right? Oh, and I mentioned that already. Sorry. Get on a little tangent. Don't look at my notes for a second. So I should probably stand right here. All right, so next we're going to talk about storing and using information. All right, so we'll talk first about variables. They're going to allow us to store static or dynamic content, define information in a script, and then store results from a command, things like that. So the first example we have here is link server equals fe1.ocs guy.local. So anytime I write a script like a provisioning script, you're going to have to use a server name in that maybe 10, 15, 20 times. And there are two ways you can make that script portable. One is you can use a variable instead of using a hard-coded name. And two is you can find and replace. So I prefer having a block up at the top to define environmental variables and storing things like names in them, right? Next, we have a dynamic or a system-generated input, so $date equals get-date. This command is really helpful when you're doing a transcript because you want your transcripts to have unique names so that you're not overwriting your old transcript every time you run the script. So when I run a transcript, I always prefix a get-date as part of the name of the file that I output. And there'll be an example of that. And then the last is user input, right? So file name equals read host prompt enter a file name. So this method's pretty basic, right? This is going to show on screen enter a file name, and the user is going to have to type the file name, not make a typo, and hit enter, right? And hopefully the file exists, they didn't mistype it, and it's in the directory that they think it is. So we'll cover more about how to do a selection box a little bit later, which using GUIs is one of my favorite things to do in scripts now. All right, then we have a set of special variables. And at the bottom here, you see get help about automatic variables. So anything that's already built in is going to be there. So again, a really helpful help command, which is just irony, isn't it? So we have a couple examples up here. We have last exit code. It shows the result exit code from our last command. Seems pretty obvious. $home is the user's home directory. And then $underscore contains all the objects from our pipeline, right? And these are all created and maintained by Windows. Nothing you have to do to make these work. All right, and the next thing is an array. An array just allows us to store information in an index. So I tend to think of arrays like an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV. It's just a list of things in columns, right? In this example, items are assigned numbers, so it does start with 0 and not 1. It's the only important thing to remember, or one of the things that might trip you up. And then there's an example here of Lync servers equals at server 1, server 2, server 3. So what that did is we just created an array named Lync servers, and it has the values of server 1, server 2, and server 3. Nothing too special. Then we can run a command against that array and do things multiple times, right? Right. So how many people have executables they'd like to run within their scripts? Right. So that one's a fun one. Not a ton of hands on that one yet. Unify Square has a utility called the CFCU, which is Call Forwarding Config utility. And it's a one-off type of tool. And it's an EXE. But a customer said, well, we want to configure 1,000 users at once with this. How do we do that? So that's where this type of thing comes in. So there's a couple of ways to run other applications or scripts within your script. The first is to use invoke-expression, right? Then the second is invoke command, and you've got a file path and PS1. And then the last one is to just call the exe directly, right? With the // and then the path to the exe. So one of the important things if you're going to run an exe is to capture the output in a format that's consistently there. So running exes and doing it within a variable doesn't always have a consistent output back to the variable. So what I've done in the past is you see my.exe2 and then the arrow and 1. What that does is it captures the standard error and puts it into standard output. And then at the bottom there, you see that I've said command output equals running the command with a particular SIP address and a forwarding setting. And I'm pushing it from the standard error to the standard output. When you do that consistently, you'll get back whatever the response was when the exe was run. If you don't do the two right arrow and 1, which is the redirection, you might get it sometimes and not other times. And then your scripts, if you're doing a comparison off of that or trying to write it, you'll have problems with your scripts. So this is something I've done pretty consistently. All right, so we're going to move on to bulk changes because we've talked about how you want to do things 1,000 times. So how are we going to achieve that? So is everybody familiar with for each loops? Okay, so a few folks. So a for each loop just executes a script block for each item in a collection or an array or a variable. So if we have a list of servers and we say for each $S in servers do this, the $S is just a subset, and it means run it against every item there. And what that's going to do is allow us to run a command multiple times. So if you're going to do something like enable users for Lync or migrate 10,000 users, you probably don't want to go into the control panel and find 200 users at a time and right-click and move. You'd probably rather just run a command and let it go, right? So that's where a for each comes in. So there's a couple common types of input for a for each, the first being a CSV. CSV is just a file with some names across the top for the columns, and then information in each column separated by a comma for the information in the next column. And I'll show an example of a CSV here in a second. We can also do a pipeline, so we could say for each, or get-80 user, and pipe it and say for each 80 user, or user in users, enable -cs user. And we'll have some examples of that as well. So then the next thing is we might need to do operators. So we might say if a user is not enabled, right? We have 1,000 users who somehow got disabled by accident, and we need to enable them all. So we could say get-cs user, and store everything, and then say if for each user and users, if enabled is not equal true, then run a command against them, right? So these operators are just comparing things, right? And again, at the bottom, we've got a link to a TechEd library and to a get-help that can tell you more about running operators. And there's a couple other ways other than operators to check our variables, right? The first one is just if variable exists. So all this is going to do is check that the variable's there and not null, right? So I use this one a lot. Basically, if there's nothing there, I don't even need to try to run the loop, right? Then I can say if the variable doesn't exist, and basically the first one says if there's anything in there, the variable's good to go, we can run it. The second one says if the variable doesn't exist, check that it's there. So sometimes I'll do if, and I'll have the bang and say a path doesn't exist, like I'm creating an output directory. Well, I don't want to create the output directory if it already exists, so I'll run a check to see if it's there. And if it's not there, I'll do like a make dir and publish that as part of the command. And then the last one is if variable.contains. So you can do a -eq or a dash not equal or any other things. But I particularly like if variable.contains. This is a little bit of one of our .NET guys taught me this. So, and I probably should have said this earlier. I'm a total hack about scripting. I have no programming background whatsoever. So a lot of these tricks other people taught me. And one of our devs taught me that you can run a command this way. And I was getting more consistent results this way. And we'll show that. So my favorite of these is if variable.contains. And you can search for anything in there. There's other ways to do it with other operators too, but this is a nice, easy way to type it for me. So I keep a list of little examples, and this is the one I always use for that. All right, so we talked about for each for a second. We've got an actual for each up here. It's pretty basic stuff. It says here we're going to find and display enabled users. So the first thing we're going to do is say $users equals get-cs user where they're enabled, right? That's all it is. So we've taken every user who's enabled and we've stored their information in users, $users. That's our variable. Now we say for each user and users, write host and then user.samaccountname is enabled. So what that does is it writes to the screen, and this is probably not the way you do anything like this normally, but it's just an example. You'd probably want to write it to an output file or something like that. But it's going to write to the screen every user who's enabled. It's going to say, John Smith is enabled, and things like that. So this is an example of a script, an input I actually use for building my labs. And this lab was used for a bunch of the Unify Square folks. And what it has here is a SAM account name with a list of all of our SAM accounts we want created, and SIP URIs and TEL URIs. So what could I do with a script with this type of input, other than throw my Surface on the ground? So with something like this, I can enable a group of users, or I could do things like set their phone number. I personally don't like setting phone numbers one by one. So, and most AD teams can give you a dump of AD that would be in a format that you could use. So, this might save you entering 10,000 phone numbers by hand and the problems that would come along with that. Now, of course, your data has to be good as well. So if you garbage in, garbage out, right? But we can't worry about that too much. So that was a pure example of a CSV and the type of input you would use. So what we're going to do is we're going to first import that CSV, right? And there's a couple ways we can do that. We could say user list equals import-CSV and point right to the file, right? It's one option. Another option is to ask the user to tell us where the file is. Because if you have a script that is hard-coded to anything, like file names or server names or anything like that, I kind of consider that a fail personally. Like you want to make it so that the script can do things dynamically. So if a script is always running against a particular file, that could be a failure. Now there are other scenarios where every night the AD team drops a CSV for new users and you want to use the same file. So in those types of scenarios, that's a good fit. The second option is to just pull in a file by asking the user to enter the file name and then importing it. So that's what that example does. So in real quick, the code here, the first bullet is one way of doing it. The second bullet and the 2 lines of code within it are a different way of doing it. So it's not 3 examples, just to be clear. That's why I bulleted it that way. All right, so here's another example of a for each loop we talked about a little bit earlier. In this one, we're saying for each user who's disabled, so users equals get CS user where object enabled equals false, and then we're going to set the user to true. So this one might be useful if somebody else writes a script that disables all of your users and you need to enable them very quickly. And if it sounds like I've got a lot of reasons why I've written silly scripts like this, it's probably because I've had to do it. All right, so we talked about the CSV a moment ago, and I showed the example of that CSV earlier. Once we have pulled the CSV in, and it's stored in a variable, every column is added in there and searchable. So we could say user list, which is what we imported the CSV into, dot the column name, and that'll show us everything in that particular column. So if we need to see the input of that or we need to use that later, that's how we do it. So as an example, here we have a file that we imported where I said, enter the file name, and you see it's C scripts users.csv. Then I imported it, and I said, I want to see all the SAM accounts from that user list. I just typed $userlist.SAM account name, and it lists them out one by one in a row. So here's an example of enabling our users from a CSV, right? So that same CSV I showed a minute ago, we take that and we import it, and then we say for each user in the user list, and then we have our brackets. So when we have a for each, after that we're going to have a set of brackets, and that any code within those brackets is going to be run in a loop, right? So for each user in that list, and we're going to run the command enable CS user with the identity of their SAM account name, their SIP address, and a hard-coded registrar pool. Now, if we want it to dynamically, or we want it to have that registrar pool pulled in from a CSV as well, if we have a multi-pool environment, then we could either add it to the list, or we could do any number of other things, like say, we're going to send one to this server, one to this server, however we want to do it. But if it's in the CSV, we could do registrar pool equals $user.registrar pool, and it would put the folks on the right pool. And this is really helpful when you're moving users around as well. So the next thing is, let's assume that we have some data here, and this is that same CSV. But notice on the CSV here, there's no tel colon in front of the phone numbers now, right? So it's not that uncommon for your AD team to not put things in a format you would want them in. right? So in this example, all we really need to do is add a tel colon to make it a valid phone number or a valid line URI that we can set up in Lync. So how many people would just open the CSV and do a Control H or something like that, or open it in Excel and go that route? Right. So I'm going to teach you a trick if you're using scripts, right? We're going to combine the data. So what we're going to do is we have that $ full E164 number. That's a new variable we're creating. And then we're combining the text here that says, within parentheses or within quotes, tel colon plus. And we're putting a little plus sign outside of the quotes. That plus sign outside of the quotes means add this other variable to it, right? So we have tel colon plus within quotes. That's text. It's not a command. It's not variables, anything like that. That's text that we're adding to every one of them. And then we're adding the line URI to it, right? So when we run that as part of our for each loop, for each user, we add the tel colon plus to their phone number that we've got from the AD team. And now we're setting a full E164 number as we run through the loop each time. So instead of trying to edit it in Excel and get tricky with Excel, or maybe the automated files coming over that way, you can also check for it to see if tel's even there. So as an example, you could say if user dot line URI dot contains tel, don't do this, right? But if it doesn't, then you have to run that command. So you could even get kind of tricky and say, sometimes my AD team does it like I want it, sometimes my AD team doesn't, right? So the ability to do this type of thing is, I rely on heavily. So combining the input you're getting from someone else with some other variables you want to set is a really handy thing to have available to you. All right, next we're going to talk about output and error checking. So one of the things I try and instill in my team is anytime you can do something and you can get your output in a format that can be used later as input somewhere else, try and do that, right? So those are some of the topics we're going to cover. The other thing is always, always, always transcript what you've done. There's nothing like doing something 10,000 times and having the window close and then realizing it didn't do what you wanted to do, but you don't know what it actually did, right? So creating a transcript, here's a quick example. Just start transcript mylog.txt. Now doing what we did earlier, just a minute ago, we combined a variable with some text of our own. Well, we could name that transcript mylog $date.txt and pull the date information in with a little bit of extra syntax here. So I definitely would encourage you, anytime you're using the transcript function, to time and date stamp it, because then every time you run the script, you're not overwriting your last transcript, right? Once we start our transcript, all we have to do is put our code in, and at the very end, our last line of code is stop transcript. And then again at the bottom, if you're going to do a transcript, make sure to do a dash verbose for all your commands that you're running, because otherwise, if it completes successfully, you might not see anything, right? So here's one example. And you can see where I've created a variable named transcript name up here. And the transcript name has create dial plans. And then we're adding a get date and formatting the date. So what that does is it creates a file named create dial plans with the date stamp in it .txt. So that's the variable name that I'm using. And then I say start the transcript with the transcript name that I just created above, right? So a real nice, easy example to do that. And then at the end of the code, we have stop transcript. And this is pulled directly from dial plans script I wrote, where the customer has up to like 12 NPA and XX combinations per site, but it's dynamic. So they give us a CSV with all the information in it, and we create all their dial plans for their, I think it was like 180 sites or something like that, all automatically, just from a CSV that they pulled out of their phone system. All right, there you see at the end, We've got, there's some blood at the very top of my screenshot, but I didn't want to show that, right? And then you see verbose, no changes were made by this command, and then you see transcript stopped, output file is there, right? But the blood was just because I was doing a demonstration, I'm sure, right? And for anybody who doesn't know, when I say blood on the screen, I'm just referring to red or errors. So didn't want anybody to think I was actually like cutting people and getting blood on the screen or anything. And then here's the file that's outputted from that, right? So you have a PowerShell transcript, you have the start time, you have who run it, you have the machine it ran from, and then you have everything it tried to do. So there you can see it had created, what is that? That is a new voice policy, or a new dial plan with the name of Cincinnati, which just happens to be where I'm from, which might be why it's called Cincinnati. All right. So transcripting's nice, but it really only shows you what you did wrong. It's not actionable. So the next thing you might want to do is add content from your commands to an output CSV. This makes it actionable. So let's say you run a script that's meant to enable 1,000 users a night or something like that, and it fails on 900 users, passed on 100, right? Well, now, how are you going to run that script against the 900 users it failed against after you fix the problem? You're going to manually edit the CSV the AD team gave you or something like that, right? So that's no fun at all. Instead of doing that, we can create, and at the top here, I'm just creating an output CSV name. And then we can add every variable to that CSV, right? So in this example, what I'm doing is I'm running a command, and I'm saying add the SIP address, the function that we're running, the setting, the result, exit code. These are just the titles of the CSV. And I'm saying add that to my output CSV. Now, when I run the actual command, I say if command output contains was modified, write host, everything's fine, and then take the SIP address that I just used to run this command, along with forward, which is the setting, right? And then a $sign setting for what we did with the forward, and say success, and put in our last exit code, and add that to an output CSV. Now I have a column that says pass-fail, right? Or something of that nature, and I can rerun it later and say if success equals false, rerun for this user, otherwise don't. And then I don't redo something for the 100 people I didn't need to redo it for. I only redo it for the 900 people that I messed up the first time because of AD permissions or something. It wasn't my fault, I promise. So here's a live example of that from the script I mentioned earlier about how we bulk modify users' call forwarding settings and things like that. And that's exactly what we use. It creates an output CSV, and it's a real nice thing because this allows me to see what happened and take action on what happened. And I'm always a big fan, if you're going to take the time to put everything in an output CSV, try and store every piece of information you possibly can in it, and make sure last exit code is one of those things, right? All right, so we've talked about over and over again how mistakes are made and they're never my fault, but when mistakes are made, we need to know about them. So there are a number of different error options we can see. So first is $last exit code, and that contains the exit code of the last thing we ran, right? Then we have $error. Every time an error occurs, it's stored here, and this is a circular buffer. So if you're really bad at PowerShell and you put up $error, you can see all your mistakes, not just the most recent one, right? You can also see $error with a 0 in paren, or in brackets there. And what that's going to do is it's going to show you the most recent error. You can also do $error 255 and see the farthest one down the queue, right? Since this is a circular buffer, there's up to 256 stored there, right? We can also increase it. If you really want to see how bad you've screwed up for the last 2 weeks and you're using the same PowerShell session, you can increase your error count to a larger size, so it's not just the last 256 errors. There's a good reason to do this, too. You could also, like, say you're going to do something 10,000 times, you could increase that maximum error count to whatever the max is, which I've never tried to figure out. And then at the end in your CSV, you could just dump it all, right? And then the last thing there, $error.clear with the empty paren clears the error buffer. So when you're done making all those errors and you type CLS, you run this command next, or right before the CLS, and then you call over people to show them what you've done. All right, the next thing we can do is create our own it's easy for me to say, error variables, right? So when we run a command, we may want to store our own information. So, and this would be great for our output CSV we did earlier, where we just add $myerror. So we have a regular set CS user command, and we have an error variable. So if this command doesn't work, everything that went wrong and everything that's shown on screen will also be stored in $myerror, and we can look at that later. So it's a real nice thing to have instead of using the built-in stuff, and you can use it in your scripts pretty heavily. And then this one's one of my new favorite ones. I learned about this one, I think, 6-9 months ago or so, and I was like, wow, you can really do this? This is great. So we have write-event log to create entries in our event log. And I mean, it's obvious, right? It's just write event log. Why didn't I think of that years ago? The nice thing here is if you have a script running like a synthetic transaction, or you're doing counts for certificate stores on the edge, or you're running a backup script as part of your deployment. I've seen a lot of backup scripts out there. People who put out backup scripts for their Lync environments, they don't tend to put out any recovery scripts, though. Not sure why on that. But if they're doing a backup script, they could also have a write event to tell whether the backup worked or not, right? So I wrote a backup and failover script for a customer to fail one data center over to another in the event of a disaster. And it has all these things in it. The backup script every night runs, and if any part of it fails, it drops a different event in the event log, and SCOM monitors that. And it tells them, hey, this event failed, and that means the backup didn't work successfully, and we might need to look into why, right? The other scenario above there, the counts for certificate store. How many people have 2010 Edge still? How many people have tons and tons of federated partners? Only a few. Okay, so I've worked on an environment where they have tons of federated partners, and the certificate store fills up, right? That's a bad thing. So I've used the write event log to create SCOM events to count the number of certificates that are in the store. And then we watch for the total to get too high and whack them and pull them right out. And while the service is running, it's probably not supported, right? But you can yank the certificates right out. The sessions stay active. And it's just a particular certificate store. And I'll show a bit about that in a minute. But this event log thing made that all possible, right? Because we run this script constantly. And when this event log fires and says, I'm getting close to filling up the store, SCOM takes action and whacks the certs out of the store. So it's a beautiful thing because this customer has 8 edge servers per data center, and they're filling these things up, and federation's dropping or remote access is dropping on those edge servers. So you don't want that to happen, right? So you got to get creative. It's all fixed in 2013, so it's always better in vNext, right? So here's an option here, or one of the examples, write to the event log. Anybody guess what event log we might write to here? Lync server, right? And we're going to say the source is LS protocol stack. There's all kinds of information out there on this. So you can actually look up all the event entry types and the numbers and all that stuff. This is kind of generic. But what we're doing here is we're putting an informational event. You see the entry type equals informational. And we're going to say event ID 65020, which is just some random number I picked off the top of my head. You might want to research that a little and not overlap with actual events. And then a message, then your message text here, right? So this is an informational event we're writing to the log, and then we can monitor that with SCOM, right? Very, very handy stuff. And we'll talk about that scenario a little more. I've actually got some examples that everyone can download from my site after this for some of this stuff. All right, so the next thing is using GUIs. So as much as I love especially for me because, again, my typing skill's bad, right? We've established that. So what we can do is use .NET to create a framework within PowerShell to bring up a GUI. So has anybody here ever downloaded the OCS Guy Quick UI and used it? All right, one person. You're the one. So this interface might look familiar to you, right? This is all PowerShell code that creates an option picker to figure out what you want to do, right? Here's another one where we've pulled information. So let me step back for just a second. In this first example, I've created a static list of things I want you to be able to choose from, right? And I wrote those entries. And you're only allowed to choose those things. It's static. Next, we have a dynamic choice where I had a client that was migrating from R2 to 2013 or 2010, and they wanted to copy their voice policies. Well, to copy them, we had to go through this process of figuring out which policy they wanted to copy and copying in, right? Because they were, user-based only in R2, and in 2010 you can do site-based. So what I did was I ran a command to find all the different user-based policies, and that's what it shows here, and you can pick that as a source and then create a new site-based policy or whatever you want with the next command. So this is an example of pulling a get-cs voice policy and displaying just the identities of those voice policies up there, right? And then my favorite is the source file, right? I really like being able to click on a file name instead of trying to type through and make sure I got it right. So I mentioned examples. There's a bit.ly URL here at the top. That bit.ly URL is also the same thing you'll get if you go to ocsguy.com and click on Script Center. And there's a Download Here button. It has a Lync conf examples and a TechEd examples folder in there. They're both exactly the same. And it's full of a bunch of the things we've talked about, and we'll still keep going here. But you can download those and use them to create your own interfaces and whatnot. But it sounds like everybody here is pretty much a scripting rock star, so you probably don't. You could probably, instead of creating your own stuff from mine, you'll probably send me fixes, right? Oh, wait, were you taking a picture? Did you get it? Cool. If not, it's going to be on Channel 9. So, and I think they're going to have the PowerPoints downloadable too. All right. So we're going to talk about some practical examples here, right? And this example is on the SkyDrive that we talked about. The first practical example here is we're going to check the cert store count reporting, right? So here's our problem, right? We need to alert on the certificate store on the edge. We just talked about this, so I kind of spoiled it, right? When the server certificate store fills up, the service availability is impacted, and we need to monitor that with SCOM. So the first thing we're doing is a really nice way of finding how many objects are in that store. So we're saying $reg count equals get the child item from this path, right? It's a really nice long string of reg stuff. I didn't write that part, thankfully. Somebody else found it and sent it to me. It was real nice of them. So this is to find the number of certificates in the store. Now, certificates are variable size, so there's no set number that is going to create the error. So we kind of just had to kind of spitball it a little bit and guesstimate. So on the next line here, we're going to write a message that says event message equals there are some number of certificates in that store, right? So back here, we counted them. And over here, we're telling how many there are, right? What might be good to do next after we know how many there are? Put it in the event log, right? So if reg key count is less than 299, write some message here. If it's less than 399, write some warning message here. And if it's larger than that, write an error message. So this script will go through and drop event logs that say, basically, I'm less than 299 certificates, you don't need to worry about me. I'm more than 300, but less than 399, you might want to start thinking about worrying about me. And then I'm over 399, I'm broken, right? So, and then you can watch this with SCOM. And then here's an example of the event log entry that we talked about earlier. And you can see that I used event message to pull the information I got here, like the number of certs. So we write the event log, right? This is the warning version, and this is the error version. And then here's the whole thing, right? So this whole thing counts the certs on your edge, and then writes an event log entry. Now, everybody can read all of this right now and understand it, right? No. That's why it's on the SkyDrive for download. So this example is a real-life example I've used in production with clients that have had that problem. If you don't have that problem, should you use the script? Probably not. You probably don't need it. You could probably have some fun with it and play with it in your lab and then come up with something cool you might want to do that's like it, but you wouldn't need it if you're not having this problem. So the next example we have is bulk adding allowed federated peers. And funny enough, when I was creating this deck for Lync conference, I was in San Diego, and a customer said, hey, I need to add a bunch of partners real quick to Federation. I was like, okay, well, let me write you a quick little script, because they had everything they needed. And I wrote a quick little script, and I said, oh, I'm doing a scripting session later this week. I should add this. So this example, was brought about by another customer scenario where they didn't have open federation, right? They had direct federation or enhanced federation. You have to be added to their list to be able to federate it. So if you have that type of scenario, somebody has to manually go in and add the federated peers and things like that. It's no fun. They'd been doing that for a while, and then they had IBM, who was going to be added to their federated peer list. Is anybody federated with IBM? There's just a ton of domains for them. So they had like 250 domains or something they were adding that week. And I was like, oh, well, let me automate it for you real quick. So I already talked about all this. So here's an example of a CSV. We've got a domain, we've got a gateway we're using, and we've got a comment about it, right? So we're going to add Contoso and their SIP gateway. We're going to add Fourth Coffee because we really like our coffee. We're going to add Unify Square because they're the Lync experts, right? I had to get the plug-in, didn't I? And then we're going to add Microsoft because they're our software vendor, right? So we've got all that information in our CSV. And here's a little pop-up window that's going to create a select box for picking our CSV. So it's not a static CSV that has to exist. It's going to be one we select. So this is something that requires user intervention, right? So all this code, all this really does is you can see a line in there that says select a CSV containing the list of federated peers. That's what's displayed. And then I'm saving the file they picked as $ file name, right? Next thing I'm going to do is import the CSV that they picked. So $feds equals import CSV file name. I'm going to create a transcript because I always create transcripts. I'm going to start the transcript, and then I'm going to run a for each loop that says for every one of those rows in that CSV, add a new allowed domain with the domain name from that column, the proxy FQDN from that column, and the comment from there, and then dash verbose and stop transcript. Now, if I was really cool, I could have done a second line that said add content to an output CSV and stored all those variables again, but I didn't do it that day. So here's the whole script to do that. Pretty easy stuff, right? All right, do we have any questions? So I'm actually on to the resources slide. I thought I had one more example, but we're good. So let's see. There's the sessions on demand information, the Microsoft Learning, everything there. Complete evaluations and enter to win. And of course, say great things about me, please, right? Is anybody going to scan the QR code? I'll leave it up for a second in case anybody wants to take pictures.